Jimmy Carter is widely viewed to be the most authentically Christian president that America has ever had. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with Dr. Neil J. Young about Carter's faith and why many Christian voters turned instead towards Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential election. Young's book, We Gather Together, The Religious Right and the Problem of Interfaith Politics, unpacks the complicated relationship between belief and political action.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
That I will faithfully execute
An undiminished, ever expanding American dream.
the office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the blight of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
I'm Neil J. Young. I'm a historian and podcaster. I'm an author of the book, We Gather Together, The Religious Right and the Problem of Interfaith Politics. It's a history of the rise of the religious right and the presence of religious conservatives in American politics in the last 50 years.
So President Carter has a unique place in that history. I think a lot of people would agree that Carter is in many ways the most objectively Christian president we've ever had in terms of devoutness and outspokenness and actions, both during and after the presidency. But he was a Democrat. And I don't know if he would necessarily qualify as a true liberal on a lot of cases, but he's certainly not part of the religious right. So how do you see President Carter fitting into the history of the rise of faith and politics?
Well, I think it's a great place to start the conversation because I think Jimmy Carter is really central to the development of the rise of the religious right, or at least he's a very important actor in this political transformation that happens in the late 70s and through the 80s and the 90s for several reasons. One, President Carter, Jimmy Carter as candidate, was the first presidential candidate to ever declare himself to be a born-again Christian. In 1976, when he's running for the presidency, he makes this comment, and he doesn't even think all that much about it because, of course, he's just speaking biographically about himself. And this is very much the language of his faith and the way that he knows to talk about himself. He mentions he's a born-again Christian, and this famously sends a bunch of New York reporters running to their dictionaries. They don't know what that means. And it becomes this huge story in the 1976 election. Newsweek and the New York Times write long articles explaining to their readers what evangelicals are and what evangelicalism is. If anything, though, that just revealed, I think, the political media's blind spot when it came to American religion. It didn't reveal some sort of surprising element of American life as much as President Carter was a representative of millions and millions of Americans who subscribe to this sort of faith. Now, the reason I start there is because I think it's important to understand that Carter really inserts religion into presidential politics in a way that I think a lot of people don't remember and appreciate. That he is one that gives us what we now think of as standard of presidential candidates declaring their religious faith and talking about it. And so that's really important just in terms of how it changes the American presidency. But I think the other really important factor here is that a lot of religious conservatives and a lot of people of religious faith, particularly people, Southern Baptist from Jimmy Carter's own denomination, are very much disappointed and feel betrayed by his presidency because they believe him to be, quote unquote, one of them. And if we're talking about religious faith, I think we can say he was. In terms of the politics of his particular presidency and some of the issues that take place during those 4 years, there's really what I think is a revolt towards the Jimmy Carter presidency that helps mobilize millions and millions of conservative religious Americans into what we would now know as the religious right movement. And certainly that's a key factor in why Reagan is able to win in 1980 and defeat Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, and it's really important to talk about that 1980 campaign and the differences between Carter and Reagan. So I definitely want to get to that. What are some of those issues that you mentioned, though, that religious conservatives took issue with Jimmy Carter over? What are some of the things that he was doing that they didn't like or thought should be different?
Well, there's three that I would point to. The first is the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a proposed constitutional amendment that would have guaranteed equality of the sexes in the Constitution. This is being looked at by it's ratified by Congress in the early 1970s. It's being ratified by states across the 1970s. And we should point out that it was largely a bipartisan support for this. President Gerald Ford and his wife are supporters of the ERA, as is Jimmy Carter and Rosalind. So it's not like it's a political issue in the 1976 election. But by the late 1970s, when Carter's actually president, there has been a huge and growing grassroots conservative movement led by Phyllis Schlafly, the conservative activist, to mobilize millions of Americans against the Equal Rights Amendment. And so in a lot of ways, it's a problem of timing, right? Jimmy Carter becomes president and has a position supporting the Equal Rights Amendment in the late 1970s, just around the time in which millions of Americans are beginning to coalesce around an anti-ERA position. And so that's part of it. Another one is gay rights. Now, I don't think Jimmy Carter was really out there when it came to gay rights. I mean, not many American political figures were in the late 1970s, but a couple of things happened. First, in 1977, one of his assistants, a woman by the name of Midge Costanza, she met with a handful of gay rights activists who came to the White House to meet with her. Carter did not even know that this meeting was taking place, but it is seized upon by conservative media and by conservative religious figures as a clue about who Jimmy Carter really is and what he is allowing to take place within his White House administration. And he's, run over the coals for this. The second thing that happens related to gay rights issues is in 1978, he goes to California and he speaks against the Briggs Initiative. The Briggs Initiative was a state ballot proposition put forward by a Republican legislator in the state of California named John Briggs that would have made it illegal for anyone in the state of California to teach in the public school system who either was gay or even expressed any support for homosexuality. And it was a ballot initiative. It ultimately was defeated in large part because Governor Reagan, not yet president, but former Governor Reagan, spoke out against the Briggs Initiative too, because he thought that this was something that was going to create just a government overreach. And Jimmy Carter also speaks out against this. But again, this is perceived by religious conservatives that Jimmy Carter is pro-homosexuality. And so this is held against him very much in the late 1970s. The most important issue, though, of course, is abortion. And I think, again, this is an issue of timing, because by the late 1970s and really going into the 1980 election, millions of white evangelicals have begun to gather around the anti-abortion position, which was not the case earlier in the decade, and not even in 1976 during the presidential race. But by the late 1970s, it has become more and more common for white evangelicals to have an anti-abortion position. And they see Jimmy Carter, who I don't think any of us would characterize as being a pro-choice politician. They see him as not firmly and uniformly anti-abortion enough. And so those three issues really sort of go together in seeing him as a betrayer of religious conservative values, and as a suspicious politician who they think is, a full blown liberal, right? Even though I don't think any historian would evaluate him as such.
You mentioned Governor Reagan at the time, governor of California, who, of course, we now know would go on to defeat Carter in his bid for a second term. They agreed on, at least in principle, on the Briggs Amendment. So how did Reagan capture so much of the support of the coalescing conservative and religious right? And how did that employ so effectively against Carter and his hopes for a second term?
It's a good question because I think looking back, a lot of people, think that Reagan was the obvious choice for religious conservatives in 1980 because we know what comes afterwards, right? But in fact, during the 1980 election, Reagan wasn't the front runner among religious conservatives. Religious conservatives were really split with the different options they had in the 1980 election. But Reagan sort of grinds out his victory over the course of the primaries. Actually, he wins quite handily over the course of the primaries, but he sort of grinds out his victory with religious conservatives because of that. And a lot of key figures, including people like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich, these are important grassroots political strategists who come to build what we know as the religious right movement, along with figures like Jerry Falwell, the televangelist. They spot Reagan as the best chance to defeat Carter, and they think that he has the right look, the right way of talking about his religious faith, and that he is the one that can kind of carry forward a conservative argument about religious faith in America. And Reagan does a great job of stepping up to the challenge, really. Now, Reagan was a person who grew up in a religious home, or at least his mother was very devoutly religious. He himself has a really complicated relationship to faith, which I think was part of why a lot of people weren't really sure they were going to support him in 1980, right? He's a Hollywood actor. He's been divorced and remarried. His wife, Nancy Reagan, isn't religious at all, and come to find out, she also dabbled in things like astrology, although that was not really known in the 1980 election. He was known to not have a good relationship with his children. He also was not a regular church attender. So all of these things were seen as very problematic, and why religious conservatives took a while to really gather behind him. But once Reagan has the nomination in the summer of 1980, he goes to have this event in Dallas that's held by a new organization called the Religious Roundtable. And there's something like 10,000 evangelical ministers are brought into this arena. And it is a religious revival that is connected to the upcoming 1980 election. You have people, again, like Jerry Falwell and James Robison, who's a famous televangelist also, giving one speech after another about the moral decline of the nation and how someone like Reagan is needed, right? They don't literally endorse him because they can't do that, or else they'll risk their nonprofit status with the IRS and all that. But Reagan rises to the podium to finally speak, and he says something along the lines of, I know you can't endorse me, but I want you all to know that I endorse you and what you're doing. And the crowd goes wild. And you can literally track the polling after this event. I believe it happened in late August 1980. From there until the election in November, his numbers with conservative religious voters just go up, 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 and up, and lead to the huge election victory that he has in November of 1980.
The current political landscape and the connection of politics, especially presidential politics, to faith is probably familiar, but that wasn't always the case. And you mentioned that, Carter was one of the first to introduce faith into politics, at least in the way that we understand it in the modern sense. So let's talk a little bit about that broader religious landscape in the 70s, what it was on its own terms, and how that differs from today.
The 70s are such an important decade for all these things that you're talking about, because it's really the decade in which so many of these transformations are taking place and leading towards what we now think, I think a lot of us take as given, right? So one of it is that just the rise of presidential candidates talking about faith, as we've already mentioned, with Jimmy Carter really introducing it. One of the stories I love about that goes along with Carter, saying he's a born again Christian, is a grassroots group sends President Ford a questionnaire and asks him to fill out, all these different policy positions. And one of the questions is something along the lines of like, what is your religious faith? And he just writes down Episcopalian. And like, that's it, right? Like, he's Episcopalian. What else is there to be said? And so I think, again, Carter, by talking about his faith openly, just brought a discourse into presidential politics that hadn't been there before. But what is also happening is an explosion of evangelical Christianity across the 1970s. In 1976, the pollster George Gallup surveys Americans, and what he finds is that 34%, 1 in 3 Americans, say that they've had a born-again experience. And so this is something that shocks, again, a lot of like academics and a lot of media figures. This is happening in the same moment in which Carter has said he's a born-again Christian, and media elites don't really know what that means. But what it does is reveals, again, not necessarily a new development, but just the sort of public visibility of what had been the case for, decades and decades, was that millions of Americans identified as evangelical Christians. However, in the 1970s, there's just a massive expansion of this particular demographic of American Christianity. And it's facilitated by things like the televangelism ministry. So in the mid-1970s, Jerry Falwell's Old Time Gospel Hour has 1 million viewers a night. Religious publications are flourishing. One of the biggest bestsellers of the late 1970s is a book written by Billy Graham called Angels. So there's all sorts of things that are happening that are making evangelicals a lot more visible. Also, as the culture is shifting in this time period. This is like, the years following the civil rights movement. The women's rights movement is playing out. The gay rights movement is starting to form together. And so all of these kind of social and cultural issues are coming to the fore of American politics. And you have more and more conservative religious Americans who believe that they need to bring their faith into the public square as a form of politics. And of course, there's, powerful figures like Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority who are helping organize and galvanize them into the political process. And that, leads to what we would identify now as the religious right. But all of those things are taking shape in the 1970s and kind of coming to a head really during the years of Jimmy Carter's presidency.
So is it fair to say that the conservative religious right, their issues with Carter weren't so much matters of faith or theology, but matters of policy and perhaps even more of public perception? But he wasn't doing enough to fight what they were perceiving as detrimental changes to the moral fabric of American society.
I think it's actually both. They do believe that he's not doing enough, and I think abortion is a good example of that. So he pretty consistently says through his administration that he has a personal objection to abortion, but he believes it's a settled law of the land, and so there's nothing to be done about it. But they give him a hard time for not supporting things like a human life amendment, which is very much at the forefront of anti-abortion politics in the late 70s, right? This idea that we could amend the Constitution with a human life amendment. He's not interested in taking that up at all. So they see that as a failure of his on a policy level, right? I do think, though, there is a theological evaluation of Carter that's happening through his presidency that's tracking alongside what's happening within his own Southern Baptist Convention, which is what we know of as the fundamentalist takeover of 1979 and 1980. So the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the country in the 1970s, the de facto Church of the South. And because of that, it contains a vast body of believers who really span the political and theological spectrum. And that's been the case for decades and decades. And in a lot of ways, that's at the heart of what Baptists believe, right? The congregational authority, the priest of the believer, that means there's a lot of flexibility here for sort of beliefs within the denomination. Fundamentalists in the Southern Baptist Convention in the 1970s say, you know what, we got to root out the heretics. And this starts in the seminaries, but it boils over into different congregations. And a lot of this is over, these theological battles over inerrancy and like whether people subscribe to the Bible being the perfect word of God or having some sort of caveats about that. But it all bubbles to a head in 1979. And there's what's known as the fundamentalist takeover, where moderates are put out of power. And since 1979, I think we can characterize the Southern Baptist Convention as a ultra-conservative fundamentalist denomination. Jimmy Carter is on the moderate side of the Southern Baptist spectrum. And if you look at the letters that Carter's White House received through the 1970s, also if you look at the letters that the Southern Baptist Convention during Carter's presidency received about him, lots and lots of Southern Baptists are saying he is not a true Christian. Because what's being identified as true Christianity in this time period is like a sort of litmus test of certain issues. And one of them is abortion. And because he doesn't have an across the board opposition to abortion, or because he doesn't have as, a fully committed political objective to outlaw it, he is seen as not being a full Christian. And that argument about him only builds in the decades after he's out of the presidency because of statements he makes about things like, women being pastors and other sorts of things. But that's already taking shape in 1979 and 1980. And that's very much a part of religious conservatives' way of talking about Carter and why they're not voting for him again in 1980, is they say he's not only been not a good president, but he's also not a true Christian.
Yeah, and Reagan and his political apparatus seem to also be able to play that message to great effect for their own ends. And of course, the dominance that they exert throughout the 80s really contributes to kind of our collective memory of Carter. Carter goes the other way, right? As soon as he leaves the White House, he fades from public political demonstrations for the most part, but he really focuses on his humanitarian work, which is absolutely done incredible things all over the world. How do you think that collective memory of Carter was initially shaped by the religious right? And do you think that he might be prime for a revisitation of the way that we remember him and even the way that we remember his faith and whether or not he was a quote unquote true Christian?
I think absolutely he is worthy of a reevaluation. And I think he is probably the president or one of a handful of presidents who stands to have his presidential years most rehabilitated by the perspective of history. And I think there's a couple of things at play there. One is just, the perspective of time always causes a reevaluation of a presidential leadership and the choices that were made at the time that are, from the hindsight of history, seen differently than they are in the moment of political analysis. I do think that Carter is someone who has enhanced his profile enormously by what he's done since being president. Now, the irony is, I think he's probably one of the presidents who was least concerned about his public profile, as at the heart of what he's done. He has been a monumental figure in the global transformation of issues around housing crises and poverty and also international democracy efforts. And he's done that all without any sort of personal fanfare. But I think that a historian evaluating those things will also reflect on what that means for understanding the presidency that he led itself. I also think that especially the Trump era is going to we've seen this, right, with George W. Bush. And I think someone like Jimmy Carter all the more benefits from just the perspective we have today of the poor state of American politics and the real decline of American leadership that something like Trump's presidency helps us just see so starkly. Because I think no one has anything critical to say about Carter when it comes to the integrity of his character and the life he lived. And so I think that those sort of evaluations of a person's character often outweigh policy decisions that were made during a presidency in terms of actually evaluating what the presidency was about.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.